Hello ladies and gentlemen, my name is Andrew Stott and I'm the Emperor of Stomaria. Today we're continuing our series on how to start a nation by discussing the different forms of government that your nation can work under.
This is how nations are built and empires are forged. For every nation that becomes integrated into the empire, for every territory that we acquire, for every citizen that joins us, for every drop of water we collect, for every seed that we sow, for every watt of energy we produce, for every silver bar that we stamp, we are securing our future.
Along with the name of your nation and the flag of your nation, the form of government that your nation works under is something that many people will automatically judge you on. And for better or worse, this is something that you're going to have to consider because this will be one of your defining features. For instance, if your flag features a lot of red, then people may assume that that nation is socialist or communist in nature. Or if the name of the nation is the glorious Grand People's Republic of Jimistan, then people may assume that that nation is not to be taken too seriously. Likewise, the form of government that your nation works under is something that will influence people's perception of you. But putting people's perceptions of you to one side, you need to think about this carefully because the form of government that you adopt needs to be practical and it needs to be workable. I have seen countless times many people coming up with government structures that are so overcomplicated that they end up paralyzing themselves. This might be because they've created 50 different government departments with 6 people involved in the actual nation. It might be because they've given too much power to people who just aren't that interested, and so the legislative body of that nation just can't function properly, it can't operate properly. And before we get into all of that, there is something that I need to discuss more broadly before we get into the meat of this issue. And that is how I define a form of government. What does it entail? So I'm going to be talking about 3 different components which makes up a form of government, certainly for the purpose of this video and certainly from my own perspective. So first, you have the government structure. So for instance, is it a federal or a unitary system? You have the source of the government's power. For instance, is it an autocracy or is it a democracy? And of course, you have the government's ideology. For instance, is it a monarchy or is it a republic? These are 3 different components which need to be considered when forming the actual government. But this is really just the tip of the iceberg, and I could spend many hours discussing the various forms of government that nations around the world work under. So for the purposes of this video, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be keeping it very, very simple. We are going to be discussing federal versus unitary. We're going to be discussing autocracy versus democracy, and we're going to be discussing monarchism versus republicanism. And within this framework, we are going to hopefully be able to discuss in more detail the kinds of government that you could work under, examples of how it might look, of how you might be able to pull something together. But this is by no means an exclusive or an exhaustive list of government structures, government ideologies, and the sources of the government's power. There is a lot more to it. We just need to keep it simple for the purposes of this video, and I would recommend that you go and do your own research as well as watching the rest of this video, just to give you an idea of what road you could go down. So before we go any further, there are a few things I just need to mention. First, when you are choosing the form of government that your nation is going to work under, you really need to base this decision on what's going to be most practical for you, what's going to be workable for you. Is it going to be able to advance your goals if you go down that particular route? That is really the only thing you need to consider. Because if you create a form of government that is detrimental to your nation, in the sense that you won't be able to accomplish what you want because of the system that you have created, then it completely defeats the object of trying to establish a government for that nation, because it is just hampering its progress. For instance, in a previous video, we discussed territory, its acquisition and its utilization. Now, the form of government that you end up adopting, a form of government that your nation will work under, this is going to have a big impact on the territorial question. And so it is very important that you go back and watch that video before progressing with this one, because it is probably one of the most important aspects of the nation building process, and it's important that you choose the right path very early on. And the other caveat that I wanted to highlight is something perhaps I shouldn't need to highlight, but I will for the purposes of this video, in that the form of government that your nation works under is going to be completely different from the governments that conventional nations work under. And this is for very obvious reasons. What we are doing is we are building nations from the ground up, sometimes within a handful of people, and then expanding outwards from there. And in the generations ahead, it will hopefully become far more than that. But the point that I want to make is that when I am talking about monarchies versus republics, when I'm talking about autocracies versus democracies, when I'm talking about federal states versus unitary states, we obviously have to take these terms with a pinch of salt in the context of what we are building, because what we are building is minuscule in every conceivable sense compared to the established conventional nations of the world. And that is something that I will touch on later on in this video, but I think it is important to mention it here. So with all of that out the way, let's get started. Federal versus unitary. A federal system is one where the power of the government is heavily distributed to local government bodies within the nation itself. That might be regions or it might be states. For instance, the United States is a very good example of a federal system. One of the biggest advantages of a federal system is that it allows for a great deal of flexibility and freedom for the people within that nation. They are not being suffocated by a bureaucratic central government body in every aspect of their lives. Everything is boiled down to a more localized level, and people will feel better represented on those levels. And having more power distributed to these sorts of entities is a good way to encourage cultural diversity, while nevertheless remaining a part of a collective whole. Now, the drawback of this is pretty obvious. If you allow the cultural identities of each of these states or these regions to flourish, there is the risk that a great deal of separatism or independence movements will also begin to take root and will begin to flourish, and it could potentially fracture the nation itself. Now, a unitary system is where government's power is concentrated into a central governing body. This might be a parliament or a senate, for example. And the UK is a good example of a unitary system. Because even though we have the Scottish Parliament, the Northern Irish Assembly or the Welsh Assembly, these devolved government bodies can simply be dissolved by the UK Parliament. That is the supreme governing authority within this nation. One of the main advantages of a unitary system is that it can provide a great deal of internal stability. But this is often at the expense of self-governance and often requires the suppression of cultural distinctions, which in itself has the potential to foster independence movements and separatism, much like it does in a federal system. But one of the main advantages of a federal system over a unitary system is that it voluntarily allows people to express themselves. It gives people greater degrees of freedom in order to express themselves. And the ability to do that without being suppressed, without having anything forced upon you, is a very important aspect of this nation building process, because you have to remember that everything that we are doing, everything that you will be done through voluntary association and voluntary affiliation. If people don't feel represented, if people are having their views, their cultures, their identities crushed or suppressed in any way, then they can just simply leave, and there is nothing you could do to stop them. So trying to create a system which benefits people at large, which gives them representation of some kind, which gives them the freedom to express themselves, is very important. Now, when it comes to the question of autocracy versus democracy, this is again where I'm going to have to re-emphasize the caveat, in that autocracies and democracies, from our own perspective, from what we're talking about, is obviously different from those of conventional nations. And just as I mentioned a moment ago, we are obviously dealing with nations that are being built from the ground up, and this is all based on voluntary affiliation and voluntary association. And that's very important to think about when we are discussing this particular topic. So with that said, an autocracy is a system where one person, one individual, has total control over the government of that nation. And one of the main advantages of this is the speed in which decisions can be made and the stability that it can create, because there is no major debates or discussions or voting or anything like that to drag out the decision-making process or to highlight certain fractures within that nation. The decision gets made and the action takes place. That is the system that we are talking about. Now, it does have the inevitable drawback in that when a decision is made unilaterally by one person, there are those within the nation that may become disinterested or disengaged in some way because they feel like their views aren't being represented or they feel like they're being ignored. And that is a very real risk. A democracy where people elect representatives or they vote directly on legislation has the opposite problems. So while they will obviously feel more engaged and they will feel like their views and their voices are being heard, it does have the inevitable consequence of dragging out the decision-making process. It will require debates, it will require certain procedures to be in place in order for anything to happen. And once more, it does have a tendency to create internal divisions. That is to say, you have people which may have disagreements with one another, but if the decision has been made from the top down, those disagreements very rarely have to rear their heads. But if everyone is discussing these issues, if everyone is debating these issues, if everyone's picking sides on every issue, on every little law, and every little action that that nation has to go through, every action that nation takes, then it will create fractures. And some nations go even further than this, for reasons completely unknown to me, in which they will actually establish political parties within their nation. And this is very perplexing to me, because when you are starting a nation from scratch, there is no real cultural tie with one another, in the sense that culture is something that develops over a long period of time. There is nothing that would unite necessarily one citizen to another other than a presumed shared sense of values. Because if you don't have a shared sense of values, then why would you establish a new nation? What is that nation supposed to represent if everyone goes off and supports different things? You might have a communist party, a liberal party, a monarchist party, or whatever else. If there is no agreement, even in the shared values and shared aspirations and shared objectives of that nation, then what is there to unite them? And this is something that I never really fully understood when it came to nations having political parties within a nation, because it's almost like you're creating divisions within a group of 10 people, and you're just never going to get off the ground like that. But that all by the by. As I say, the main disadvantage, the main problem of a democracy of any kind is that it does drag out the decision-making process, and it does have a tendency to cause divisions within that nation. Now, regardless of which route you go down, you have to remember, as I have said repeatedly in this video, that this is a nation that you are building, which is based on voluntary association and voluntary affiliation. If you're an autocrat, you still have to take into account the opinions of the citizenry, because ultimately, if they wish to leave, then they can do, and there's nothing you can stop them from doing so. Likewise, in a democracy, if there is too much infighting, if there's too much deadlock, if there's too much dragging of the feet, then people will likewise get fed up, disengage, and they will simply leave. So these are things you need to consider. Neither system is perfect. Neither system is without flaws. But what you really have to consider is how you want to go about governing your nation from a practical, workable standpoint. What is going to benefit you? What is going to benefit your nation? What is going to get things done? How are people going to be represented fairly without having the cogs of government grind to a halt? Now, when it comes to monarchism versus republicanism, I could have perhaps shoehorned this into the question of autocracy versus democracy, but ultimately I decided not to, because they aren't the same thing, in the sense that you can have a monarchy which is democratic, and you can have a republic which is autocratic. You only have to look at the modern world to see that. A good example, again, would be the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom is a monarchy. It is the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We have a monarch, but no one, I think, would argue that the United Kingdom wasn't a democracy, in the sense that we have a legislature which is elected by the people. Now, you might question the validity of that system, you might question the electoral system that we have, you might question how good a system that is, but we don't have King Charles, for instance, dictating to us what we can or cannot do. He doesn't pass legislation in his own right, and so on and so forth. So it is democratic in that sense. Likewise, you might have any number of the republics that have come and gone over the years, which have been ruled by military dictators of some kind, without any genuine free and fair elections, when they would be considered autocratic, but they would still be defined as a republic of some kind. So that, again, there is that crossover, and that is important to mention, but that isn't really what I want to discuss here, because what I want to discuss here is a very simple question. Who owns the nation? Now, this might seem like a very strange question to ask, and were we talking about conventional nations, it certainly would be. But because we are talking about aspirant nations, because we are talking about nations that are being built from the ground up through voluntary association and voluntary affiliation, the question does have to be asked. And this goes back to the video that I was discussing earlier regarding territory. This is why I wanted to make the video regarding territory before the video regarding the form of government that a nation has. Because ultimately, you need to decide very early on which route you're going to go down on that front. So if you're going to acquire private freehold land, who does that belong to? Because if it belongs to a single individual, then it is very likely that you go down the route of a monarchy. If it belongs to the wider community, if there are multiple legal owners, then you'll probably go down the route of some kind of republic. Now, this is not set in stone in any shape or form, but you do need to decide very early on how you're going to go about doing this. Because as I say, typically, if you're going to go down the monarchist route, it is a single person that has total control, total authority, and total ownership over all the nation. And that will get passed down to a singular heir of the monarch's choosing. Now, that is, in a nutshell, why we have this distinction for this particular video between monarchism and republicanism, because the alternative to that is that it belongs to the wider community, and that comes with a myriad of its own problems, not least if people want to pull out, if people aren't interested anymore, then it will require the actual sale or the dissection of the territory of that nation. It will literally be pulled apart. And so this is something you need to consider. Now, going down the monarchist route is also not foolproof, in the sense that the heir of their choosing, of the monarch's choosing, may lose interest at some point and decide to sell up on their own accord. But the risk is a lot less because there are fewer people involved in that decision-making process. But again, this is just something I wanted to highlight for this little particular segment, because we discussed autocracy versus democracy, there's advantages and disadvantages of that. But when it's monarchism and republicanism, I did want to specifically mention the question of who owns the land, who owns the territory, who owns the nation. When it comes to Stomaria, we are, unsurprisingly, an absolute federal monarchy, which should tell you all you need to know about our own form of government, of our own system of government, how we operate and why we operate in the way that we do. As an absolute monarch, as an autocrat, I have complete and total control over Stomarian territory. And this is something that should come as no surprise, because all Stomarian territory is private freehold land that is owned by the imperial family. That is how we define Stomarian territory. And this territory is divided into provinces, with each province being governed by a governor, and that governor will come from a member of the imperial family or Stomarian nobility, that is to say, citizens who are not part of the imperial family, but have nevertheless invested enough time, enough resources, enough energy, and have been committed and devoted enough to attract our attention and to be elevated to a position of responsibility. So these are the creme de la creme of the citizens of Stomaria. These are people that I trust. And appointing these governors to govern these territories, as opposed to having elected representatives, as opposed to having democracy to dictate what can and cannot happen on my own land, is obviously something that I won't tolerate. I am the owner of this land. I'm the owner of this territory. And I want people that I can trust to look after it. And if they don't look after it, then they will simply be dismissed and someone else will be appointed. It is a very smooth, seamless way to govern Stomarian territory. And beyond even the governance of the territory itself, I'm not hamstrung in any shape or form by bureaucratic legislative procedures, in the sense that if I want to do something, if I want Stomaria to go in a certain direction, then I will make that decision and then I will enact that decision. I will push for that decision to become reality. I do not require anyone's approval. I do not require anyone's authorization. I do not need to beg. I do not need to compromise. I simply do what I believe to be right. Now, beyond Stomaria, we obviously have the member states of the Empire, because the Empire of Stomaria does not just consist of Stomaria. It consists of the member states of the Empire. For instance, the Republic of Vesta and the Kingdom of Wayward. Now, these nations, these communities, have territories in their own right, and I have absolutely no jurisdiction over those territories, in the sense that it is not my land, so why would I have any authority or control over it? These nations have been brought together for a very simple purpose. The Empire of Stomaria is an empire of trade, of commerce, of enterprise. And while there are certain things that we insist upon, a common head of state, a common foreign policy, a common monetary system, common citizenship, common territory, common language, and more besides, the domestic affairs of each of these member states are entirely of their own prerogative. They can act and do as they please. And this is very important because, as I mentioned earlier in this video, having a federal system, having people becoming a part of your nation, of your community, without infringing upon their right to self-identity and self-governance, that is very important. And Stomaria has grown because of its understanding that people may want to form a part of a larger entity, but they may not want to surrender their own identities. Now, these member states of the Empire, as well as the provinces of Stomaria itself, are all represented in the Imperial Court. This is an advisory body that we have, which allows all of these representatives to come together in order to discuss the future of the Empire, to discuss the progress that each member state in each province has been making, and to build a sense of camaraderie and friendship, to build closer ties with one another. That is the purpose of the Imperial Court. But it is not there to dictate to me what I can and cannot do. But what it does do is it gives me an opportunity to gauge the response of those involved. And this helps me to ascertain as to whether or not what we are doing, what we propose to do, is actually going to bring people in or drive people away. Now, don't get me wrong. Every decision that I make is going to have consequences, in the sense that there will never be universal consensus on the decisions that are made. That is just a fact of life. And we have had nations that have left the Empire precisely because of disagreements in terms of the direction that Stomaria and the Empire was going. However, that is a small sacrifice that I am willing to make in order to allow for maximum flexibility and maximal freedom for the member states of the Empire, because I have no interest in dictating the aspects of their own nations. They are free to develop and evolve as they see fit. And if they decide at any point that the Empire is no longer for them, then, as I have said many times before, we will never hold them back. We will simply wish them well for the future and move on. That is the simple reality of things. Everything we are doing is based on voluntary association and voluntary affiliation, as I've said many times in this video and as I've said many times in the past. So when we are talking about this nation building process, you have to accept reality as what it is. And that reality is that people will disagree with you and they will leave because of it. It might be trivial, it might be nonsensical in your eyes, but it will happen. And of course, as a monarchy, the governing body of Stomaria is very stable and it's very consistent, with a clear line of succession, with Stomaria, which consists of various private freehold lands, being passed down to Princess Eleanor, and then eventually to her children. We know who is going to be the ruler of Stomaria generations in advance. Our system of government may not be for everyone, and it may not be perfect, but it is best suited for us, for who we are, for what we are, and for what we're striving to achieve. And hopefully it'll give you some idea of how you might go about creating a government for your own nation. So, if you enjoyed this video and you wanted to show your support for Stomaria, then please feel free to give this video a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and we'll catch you in the next one.